Welcome to my talk about securing technology investments and open source funding. It's obviously not such a creative topic as Sean's talk, but I hope I won't bore you too much because it's actually a pretty important topic for all of us, right? So as Joshua said, and as we said in the morning, my name is Mick, my name is Marco. I'm the founder of Main Matter. We are a web engineering consultancy, right? We design, build web applications for international clients, and we also mentor teams, right, and help them sort of deliver better results faster and more reliably. And we do have a bit of a technology focus on a set of some core technologies. One of them is Rust, which I just want to briefly mention here. And because we like Rust so much, we also organize a Rust conference, Eurorust, that I have told some of you about already. And that's going to happen next month, October 12 and 13 in Brussels and online. It's sold out though, so I can't really invite you to come, but you can still join remotely. And there are some stickers over there on the table. Of course, though, also we do have a focus on other technologies as well, and one of them is Ember, right? So we've been heavily involved with the Ember ecosystem community for many years, right? I think we're one of the leading Ember consultancies right now. So we help organize EmberFest, obviously. We do Ember Europe with our friends from Intercom. We maintain some relatively widely adopted add-ons in the ecosystems, had some people on the core team and so on, right? So we are really involved with Ember, and we have been doing consulting for many years, specifically with Ember, working sort of with an international team that build on Ember, right? And all of these companies and others sort of make significant investments sort of on the basis of these open source projects they choose, and they need to make sure like those investments are secure for the future, obviously, right? And today I want to talk about how they can do that and how funding of open source projects relates to that, like funding of open source projects in general. And I would like to start by briefly reviewing what building on open source means, right? Of course, we're all building on open source all the time, right? We build on Ember and many other projects sort of below it, on top of it, and to the sides of it. And out of all the code that's needed to run our applications, like from low-level system code over networking stuff to JavaScript VMs and browsers and so on, we only write a tiny fraction of that ourselves, actually, right? If we wanted to write all of the code ourselves, like kind of from the compiler to the UI, we would never get anything done, obviously. Instead, all of the code that's not unique to our application, right, and all of the work that goes into like maintaining that code or like creating that code initially is externalized to other parties, and we don't have to do that work ourselves, right? But these other parties do that. And who those other parties are, we often don't really think or care much about, right? We assume they exist somehow, and they will just like continue to maintain and evolve these open source projects we build on, and thus make an investment in it, right? Indefinitely, essentially. But we should be looking closer maybe since sort of who created and maintains a project and how they will continue to be motivated to keep doing so in the future has a critical impact on the sustainability of these technology investments we're making, of course, right? And obviously there's an endless stream of open source projects being created all the time, and they exist for like different reasons, and the authors have different motivations. I'd say, though, that sort of the following three cases are typical for the funding of most of the open source projects we build on usually, right? So first of all, you have the scenario where a company sort of has consulting or paid support business model around an open source project, right? Some examples here, right? So like SQLite and MySQL Assert, Sidekick, Laravel, and others. And sort of they would maintain the project and offer paid for like consulting or support around it, and then the revenue coming in through that support or consulting offering funds the work on the open source project, and the company is motivated to sort of to maintain and evolve the project sort of over time to sustain and grow their support business model, right? Another similar case is open source projects that serve as sort of a sales funnel, ideally, for product or service offering, right? And the most famous example in the front-end world is Vercel, right, who maintain React and Next.js with the goal of getting people to use their hosting offering, obviously, right? And revenue from their hosting offering, besides a bunch of VC that we sort of want to ignore here for now, sort of that funds the development on these projects, and they are motivated to maintain and drive adoption of the project, sort of to grow their product sales, essentially. And finally, you have projects that are mainly driven and maintained by individuals, right? The Vue project and ecosystem is one example, but also the NPM ecosystem overall, really, right? There's loads of node packages maintained by individuals, sort of that like somehow become part of the stack of sort of big technology investments of bigger companies. And also Ember, of course, right, is driven mostly by individual contributions, at least these days. And people working on such projects are mainly motivated by like enthusiasm and often a sort of an almost emotional connection they feel to the projects and communities, right? And this emotional connection is something that's really strong in Ember for sure, right? Like many people have a lot of enthusiasm and love really for Ember and its community, which is great. And also like one of the reasons why EmberFest is such a nice conference, right? Because you always feel that sort of notion of community and people enjoying that. The other motivation sort of for many people to invest their own time without any direct financial compensation sort of into these projects is to advance their careers, right? It's always good to have sort of popular and respected open source project in a CV when applying for a new job or when looking for a new project as a freelancer also, right? Like I'm the maintainer of so-and-so and sort of you're already using that, might make sense to hire me. So now, especially with open source projects maintained by individuals, the potential risk you're facing, like when using them, is that in the worst case, you end up in a situation like this, right? You're building systems and making like investments based on foundations that depend on a random person from Nebraska, right? And this is obviously based on a similar XKCD, which I guess you've all seen before, right? And of course, this isn't a situation you want to be in. Right? Like your potentially multi-million investment depends on that one guy from Nebraska continuing to maintain sort of that key dependency sort of that your investment is based on, right? And then if the random person from Nebraska walks away, right, and stops maintaining that dependency, sort of that key dependency won't get security updates, there won't be new features released, and so that can lead to sort of no progress being possible in a particular part of your system anymore, right? At the same time, the random person from Nebraska doesn't owe you anything, right? They might abandon the project at their own will any time, right? And no other person might step in and take over maintenance, right? And also you might not be able to replace the dependency with something else easily without making a massive investment. So overall, the investment you made by building your system, possibly with a large number of people over the course of years, right, is based on a rather fragile solution, a rather fragile foundation in the worst case. And what companies can do to strengthen these foundations, right, and keep them strong over time is what I want to talk about today. And of course, I want to talk about that specifically in the context of Ember, right, not just in general. So what does the situation look like in Ember, right? And contrary to the XKCD we saw before, Ember isn't just some dependency several levels down the stack, right? But a complete framework and ecosystem, really, right? So the set of dependencies we need to look at are Ember Source, Ember CLI, Ember Data, all of the add-ons we are using, and so on, right? In relation to all of the code sort of in those packages, there's only a tiny bit of application code on top of that, really, right? Which are these like small gray or white boxes here. So the question now is, who is Ember's random person from Nebraska, right? Maintaining all of these packages. And those of you who have been in Ember for some time will know that for many years, the answer to that question was, it's this guy, of course, right? And this might be a bit too small to recognize him. It's Robert Jackson, of course, right? Although as far as I know, he's not actually from Nebraska. I think while there were other people working on the project as well at the time, I assume none of them would be offended by me saying sort of that for some time, Robert was the like Atlas carrying the weight of the whole world on his back of the Ember ecosystem, right? And he did a great job, right? Like things move forward as like at quite good pace. Sort of he was always everywhere and so on. Obviously, it wasn't all him, right? But he played a big part in that, right? And then for some time, sort of around the time, or I think a bit afterwards, maybe, and Ember's random person from Nebraska was also LinkedIn, right? Who invested quite a bit of money for many years, and we all benefited from that, right? We saw massive sort of advancements like Fastboot and GlimmerVM and more, right? But LinkedIn isn't investing so much anymore, right? So what's the situation now? There's a group of individuals maintaining the project, right? I think some of them are here, at least Ed is here, of course, and there's other people, obviously. So the pictures I'm showing there sort of is not sort of the exhaustive list, but sort of, there's a group of people, right? These are just the 5, the top so-and-so contributors over the last few months or so from the Ember.js repository. And all of these people have different backgrounds, work for different companies, right? And in fact, there's actually a feature of Ember, right? The setup is, the project is set up so that it's open for everyone and sort of encourages a heterogeneous group of contributors, right? So no single party can take ownership of the project. But the problem we're facing currently is the group of people maintaining Ember is relatively small, right? And it's been shrinking a bit for the past few years, I would say, right? Like some people have moved on to other projects or have found new focus areas in life, like having kids, right? And having more of a life, which is also great, right? And we should sort of like celebrate that, really, right? And while the remaining maintainers do great work, sort of they're all maintaining the project on the side, really, right? And they cannot prioritize working on Ember above everything else because they also have sort of main jobs and products they're working on. And rightfully, none of these people sort of is dedicating their entire life and free time to working on Ember, right? And also, as much as they want Ember to succeed and want teams and companies that build on Ember to succeed, right? The security of technology investments of companies that are not their employers, right? And they are not, they are not getting paid from, sort of is naturally not going to be their top priority. And the consequence of all this is after 2019, things have slowed down a bit, right? Like this is the repo activity or whatever that chart is called from GitHub for the main Ember.js repository. And progress in the Ember project and the wider ecosystem as well has slowed down a bit, right? And we're losing momentum in a way. And less momentum means we're also attracting fewer individual new contributors, right? The hype has long gone elsewhere. And few people come fresh into Ember these days, right? And there's little potential for sort of advancing your career by contributing or building an add-on, as Ember is sort of a comparably small market. At the same time, the group of contributors gets smaller, as mentioned before, so we end up in a bit of a vicious cycle. And again, I want to be very clear about that, right? I'm not blaming anyone, especially not the people that still maintain Ember, obviously, right? If you absolutely want to blame someone, sort of you can blame all the people who are not working on Ember, right? Like myself, or I guess almost everybody here, right? On the other hand, sort of blaming is like always boring and never helpful anyway, right? I think what's more interesting and constructive is assessing the situation and looking for ways forward, right? So what is the situation, right? Like progress has slowed down and that has some consequences, right? For example, there are 50 accepted but not implemented RFCs. And these are all sort of already signed off plans for evolving Ember, right? But no progress is being made towards shipping those changes simply because nobody's doing the work. For the past 3 EmberFests or so, in the closing panels, always called the future of Ember, we've been talking about Embroider, right? And the fact that it's going to come eventually. And everyone here understands how critical it is for the future of the Ember ecosystem, but it's still not really here. Outside of the Ember project, of the sort of core Ember project, and in the wider ecosystem, things have slowed down a bit as well, right? With many once popular add-ons not really being maintained anymore, and no new alternatives having come up, right? At the same time, the ecosystem remains in what's been called the pit of incoherence, right? Sort of we're still in this transitional period from the old Ember programming model into the world of new Ember. Right? And it's not a great place to be in, but we all understand, so if we have to go through it to eventually to eventually come out stronger on the other side. Problem is, we've been in the pit for a while, right? Like, this is Tom Dale talking about it 4 years ago, and by now Tom isn't even an active member of the ecosystem anymore, right? And again, no blaming, right? People move on to other things, and that's life, right? So despite all this, many companies, of course, have made massive investments in Ember, right? They built big applications over many years with teams of dozens or sometimes hundreds of engineers, and these companies are worried, right, about those investments being at risk, right? They see it's hard to hire for Ember, as few people have experience, right? And it's not easy to attract people with different backgrounds to work on Ember, right? We hear from companies that try to hire React people, and they say, I don't want to work with Ember. I'm not, like, I'm going somewhere else. Ember is also still lacking capabilities sort of that other frameworks have had for some time, right? Think about things like bundle splitting and so on. And Ember's tooling is lacking, right? Like, most famously, our build system is like significantly slower than what everyone else is using, and we would really all like to have Vite eventually. So the worry is that Ember might become legacy technology eventually, right? Which, if that happens, might force companies to think about whether they would eventually have to rewrite the application in something else in the worst case, right? And some companies made that decision already or are in the process of thinking about that, right? I don't know any details about any of these companies' decision-making processes, right? And I don't want to judge those decisions. I'm sure there are also many factors involved that sort of we all don't know anyway, but I'm sure none of these teams are making these decisions lightly, right? Because they're all very well aware of the cost that comes with deciding for a rewrite, right? Rewriting something that is built with loads of engineers over years is going to take long, and nobody is going to say how long. It's going to cause massive cost and slow down your value delivery for a long time, because sort of you're like delivering no user value as you're just rewriting the same thing in different technology. But of course, there's an alternative as well, right? Which is securing investments that have been made and avoiding sort of the risk to potentially having to rewrite eventually in the worst case. So instead of sort of throwing your hands in the air, like in face of a difficult situation the Ember ecosystem is sort of facing right now, as described before, and instead of saying, bad luck, we bet on the wrong horse, nothing we can do, seems we have to rewrite for the next 17 years and spend 100 million along the way. Companies can step up, right? They can actively support technology, in this case Ember, that they have built on and thus invested in, and that they have an actual business interest in to be sustainable, so that those investments that have been made already remain secure for the future, right? And I want to talk about how that works, obviously, right? However, before I talk about what I mean and how that actually could work and how stepping up like that works, I want to clarify what I don't mean and what I don't want to talk about. Often conversations about contributing to open source projects sort of you depend on are about who benefits should also give back, right? Which means sort of approaching the topic from like an almost ethical perspective, right? And while I think it's always interesting to have the conversations, there's another slide before that. So the wording is often about like giving and donating then and so on, right? And while I would say sort of having these conversations is interesting on a sort of theoretical level, maybe, I think the approach to the topic is not really helpful and in a way harmful, actually, right? And mainly it's not going to lead to the desired outcome, right? Like, first of all, an engineer building something for the employer based on open source, right? They shouldn't feel guilty about that or pressure to give back, right? Like, to the open source world, in the worst case, in their spare time, right? They're doing their job. And of course, they're leveraging open source, sort of doing it as the license allows for that, right? And as mentioned before, sort of not using open source would mean nobody can ever get anything done anyway, right? And open source licenses don't really have clauses saying, like, you can use this commercially, but you should really feel bad about doing so. Okay. At the same time, right? While the engineer's employer sort of benefits commercially from the engineer using a particular open source project, right? Like trying to convince the company sort of to give back on moral grounds is going to be hard, right? Like for-profit companies are what they are, right? For profit, they care about money and they don't want to spend money they don't have to spend, right? And honestly, if we want to get companies sort of to donate money for good causes, I think there's a million other things they should be sort of they should be donating for first, like from, ending world hunger to saving the environment. And I think the good thing, though, is you don't even need sort of that moral argument, right, to convince companies to invest in open source projects they depend on. Right? They have business reasons to be interested in investing in those technologies anyways, right? As they want to secure sort of the technology investment that they have made already, as I explained before, right? So really the conversation is not about morals or anything, but it's about money in the end. Right? In order to ensure sustainability and progress in open source projects that companies depend on, right, they need to invest money, right? Either directly or indirectly. Because money will allow people to work on open source projects and prioritize the work, right? If it's work they are doing for free, they will obviously tend to prioritize it below paid for work, right? That they could be doing as well. And as mentioned before, no maintainer of an open source project owes you anything anyway, right? Especially not companies that chose to build on that project and make money with what they build, right? And I also don't know any company sort of that would seriously have that expectation, right? Like we build on whatever this thing and now has to be maintained for free by that person because we base our multi-million or whatever business on that. Right, so the interesting question here is not if, but how companies make real financial investments in open source projects that they depend on, right, in their own interest. And I talked to many companies about this over the course of the past few months, right, and they all realize the need for making these investments, but they don't really know how to invest, right, and how to pitch those investments to decision makers to actually get budgets approved. And the simplest way to invest money is something like GitHub sponsors or Open Collective. These are sort of nice and simple ways to give money to people or teams working on open source projects. However, giving money this way is often like a mostly symbolic sign of appreciation, right? With people sort of receiving 20 euros a month from a sponsor or whatever. And if you want to reach higher amounts that can actually make a difference, sort of you need to be backed by a really large community, right? Which is something at least Ember doesn't really have. Also, even for projects that have larger communities and receive higher amounts this way, right? Giving money this way is a bit undirected for the donating side, of course, right? You throw money at something and trust it will be used well. But you don't really know whether the way the money is going to be used is aligned with sort of your priorities and your needs and your goals, right? In the end, though, companies investing into open source sort of need to be able to make a business case, right, for what specifically they invest in on the one side and what value comes out of, and what value comes out for them on the other side. Some ecosystems have established foundations, right, in order to provide a more sort of directed and organized way for companies to invest into the future of ecosystems, like the Rails Foundation, the Erlang Ecosystem Foundation, or the Rust Foundation. However, foundations come with their own problems, right? I'm sure you all have heard about all the drama going on around the Rust Foundation, right? Like we are an active part of the Rust community and a member of the Rust Foundation, and we've experienced quite a bit of that firsthand, right? So foundations can be an answer, but aren't easy and have quite a bit of overhead cost anyway, right? So for a small ecosystem like Ember, they might not work at all. Another way to invest in open source besides investing money directly is having your engineers contribute, of course, right? So you kind of end up indirectly investing money, right? Because you're paying your engineers to work on Ember in this case. However, in most cases, that looks something like this, right? You can spend like every second Wednesday afternoon to contribute to Ember. Open source projects like Ember, right, are typically used by product companies, build products, obviously, right? And their engineers' top priority isn't working on open source projects like Ember, but moving the company's product and business forwards, right? And they might be able to make a bit of their time sort of available for these things, for working on open source, but their work is typically not going to be prioritized or to sort of remain prioritized over weeks and months, right? And product managers would sort of typically sort of go and try sort of to get that time back, right? So the engineers can work on features instead. And with half a day per week or like whatever, only though the engineers won't be able to have a substantial impact anyway, right? And then sort of that means they will have little to show to their management in terms of sort of results coming out of the invested time, and thus won't be able to justify the investment towards their management. Sort of, so these arrangements typically don't last very long. So coming back to Ember now, what the ecosystem needs, right, is something more than a group of people sort of maintaining Ember besides their main jobs, right, or their main priorities, whatever that is, spending a little time here and there working on the project, right? Because the pace of progress that such a setup can lead to is almost necessarily slow, right? Because overall, it's not a lot of time being invested, because can't be, right? And we need to increase that pace significantly, right, to ensure the longevity of the ecosystem and the secure investments that have been made into Ember, right? So what Ember needs is a team of people working on a number of major initiatives in the ecosystem sort of as their main and only priority, right? So that they can actually have a substantial impact and then push the ecosystem forward out of that pit of incoherence and beyond, right? If we don't just want to stay there forever, right? It's maybe a bit too negative, but you get what I mean. So that's my assessment of the status quo, right? Of course, I don't just want to stand here sort of and be all negative, right? Instead, I want to like inspire some positivity and propose solutions and a way forward. And I want to share with you something that we did, sort of an initiative that we did or that we started as a first step forward, right? So some of you might have heard of the Embroider initiative that we are running with some sponsors. Embroider, Ember's new and coming build system, sort of, as we all know, is arguably sort of the single most important thing in the Ember ecosystem right now, right? As we thought before, and as I think everybody here knows. Embroider shipping sort of will allow Ember to drop a bunch of custom build tooling, will make it easier to integrate with the rest of the JavaScript world, and sort of allow for much improved build and specifically rebuild times, right? The initial build is not maybe as important as rebuilds. In addition, Embroider remaining unshipped sort of currently blocks a number of other initiatives, right? Like a new router and so on, which can't really progress until Embroider is shipped and adopted across the ecosystem, right? Yeah, it's been in development for a bit, right? With the first commit more than 5 years ago, and Embroider still not being 100% complete and rolled out across the ecosystem, right? Specifically Embroider optimized, I think almost nobody's using yet, right? And while Ed is awesome, of course, how much longer is it going to take, right? And why would Ember, and with it the future of the Ember ecosystem, sort of depend on mainly one person anyway? As I said, we've been there before, and while Rob and Ed are both great, this isn't ideal, right? And replacing Rob with Ed now doesn't really fundamentally change the situation. So companies that have bet on Ember are still concerned they might have to rewrite eventually in the worst case, right? The question like we asked ourselves sort of was how we can support these companies, right? And how we can stop them being concerned, but remain kind of passive and become more active and contribute to secure the investment they made in Ember by helping them to ship Embroider as a first step, right? And we asked those companies, would you rather be at the risk of having to spend an unknown number of millions of euros or dollars or whatever in 2 years, 3 years, whatever, in the worst case, to rewrite your Ember app to React or whatever? Or instead of doing that, you can spend 50K now to address the risk your technology investments sort of are facing and help prevent sort of a potential need for a rewrite, right? And while 50K isn't enough to pay a complete team to work on Embroider full time and get it shipped, right? If 10 companies come together and invest 50K each, it well is enough to pay a full team for a year, right? So we presented that calculation to companies, right, that had invested in Ember, and we said, sort of, here's what it takes to ship Embroider. If we get the funding, our team will work on that full time together with that, and we'll ship Embroider, and with that help sort of secure the investments you have made into Ember, right? Plus, there's the immediate benefits sort of for your team and product of getting access sort of to capabilities like bundle split that you want to have, and increase efficiency through much faster build times. And many companies said yes to the idea, right? And sort of they decided to get on board and fund that initiative. In fact, many of these companies were really happy about the fact sort of that we offered them an easy opportunity to invest in Ember, right? As they had been wanting to invest and become active, but weren't sure how, right? And while we didn't meet 100% of the funding goal, this is not a complete success story, so you can also talk to me later if you want to get on board. We now have a team working on Embroider full time, right? And we already made some good progress. And we're confident we can find more sponsors sort of to back this initiative and ship Embroider soon. And without this initiative, right, if progress would have continued as before, right, it would still be unclear when Embroider would eventually ship, like not whether, right? So I believe this initiative is a strong positive signal for the entire ecosystem, right? And because of that, I believe sort of the next step for the community is to think about what could come after the Embroider initiative, right? Embroider isn't the only critical milestone for the ecosystem, but there's more after it, right? And many of those things are maybe just as important as Embroider, right? And I believe that the Embroider initiative can be sort of an inspiration for the ecosystem to talk about how we can establish some kind of sustainable and stable long-term system, right, that makes it easy for companies that have made investments in Ember already to secure those investments and invest in the project, right? The point is, like, no company's massive technology investments sort of need to depend on a group of individuals that are sort of investing a lot of their own time, like passion and energy, but also rightfully don't want to invest like unhealthy amounts of those, right? As much as we appreciate the investment being made, like it's not something you want to sort of base your multi-million business on, maybe, right? And LinkedIn might not be investing so much anymore, right? But there's a number of companies sort of that have an interest in Ember continuing to progress also without LinkedIn, right? It's not like nobody's left. And if they all come together, I think they easily have the power to make a difference, right? And put Ember on a solid foundation for the foreseeable future. And by that, securing their own investments they made into the framework. And as I said before, right, this is not about morals and giving back or anything, right? It's hard to get budgets approved on those grounds anyway, and it's also misleading, as I said before, right? Investing in Ember is a pretty simple business case, really, right? And in fact, the business case is so simple that I would actually be astonished and shocked, frankly, if bringing all these companies sort of that have invested in Ember together does not work out, right? And any of these companies finds themselves in a place where they feel they need to rewrite and some other technology in a few years. So yes, right now we're in the pit of incoherence, right? And it's a pit of like fear, uncertainty, and risk, really, for me. But we do have all the means we need to get out, right? And the investment necessary to get out compared to the potential cost in the case of not investing now is neglectable almost, right? So my message with this talk, right, is sort of now is the time to gather the herd, right? And sort of through a mutual effort ensure a sustainable future for the entire herd. And with that, for each individual member of the herd and the investments that they made in, right? So we would love to sort of like foster conversations about these topics across the community, right? Like I'm not saying everybody needs to give us money so we can do the second initiative. We're happy to be involved, but for now, sort of we want to sort of use the initiative as an example, sort of to prove that this model can work and see how we can like evolve that sort of towards the next step that involves the entire community. So, if you want to be a part of those conversations or you want me to explain sort of the business case for investing into Ember, or you just want to get on board the Embroider initiative, or you just want to see what you can do, right? Like please reach out to me or main matter on Twitter or via email or, of course, talk to me or the rest of our team here in Madrid. And with that, thanks for having me and thanks for coming to EmberFest.